And joining me now from Melbourne is the Greens leader, Adam Bandt. Adam Bandt, thanks so much for your time this morning. I've just got to start with the question on everyone's lips around federal politics at the moment. Are you about to do a repeat of the 2009 ETS situation where the Greens worked with the coalition to block an emissions trading scheme?
Well, look, we've made an offer to the government to pass their legislation, and we've said that despite the significant problems in the legislation around unlimited offsets that could see pollution continue to rise rather than fall, around the low targets, the fact that it's Tony Abbott's mechanism which raises questions about whether it'll work, we've offered to pass it next week with one change, and that is stop making the problem worse. Stop opening new coal and gas projects, because you can't put the fire out while you're pouring petrol on it. Now, 66% of young people and 57% of Australians are with us on that. They don't want to see new coal, oil and gas projects opened in a time of climate crisis. So really, the ball is in Labor's court now. Things have moved on a lot since the time that you're talking about, and we now have young people marching in the streets behind banners that say no new coal and gas. As I say, an overwhelming majority of the population wants the government to stop opening coal and gas. It's really up to Labor now to justify why they want to keep opening coal and gas projects while Australia is burning, going through droughts and getting flooded.
Do you accept that if the government agreed to your request on coal and gas, they'd be gifting the next election to the coalition?
Absolutely not. Like I've just said, things have moved on, and I think the government hasn't quite picked up just how much people in this country want climate action. At the last election, the parties that backed more coal and gas saw their vote go backwards. The parties and independents that said, no, we've got to keep coal and gas in the ground, saw our votes go up. Now, this would be enormously popular because the counterfactual is Tanya Plibersek has to explain to the voters of Sydney why Labor wants to keep opening coal and gas projects, or to the voters on that in the seat of Richmond or the seat of Macnamara.
No, I understand that, Mr. Bandt, but Tanya Plibersek, as Environment Minister, just knocked back a coal mine in Queensland. It's not like the government's approving every mine at the moment, right?
The Environment Minister also approved a coal mine to keep going out till 2063. 2063, at a time that they say they're committed to net zero. They're approving coal mines to 2063. And this is the point, Andrew. The government's projections at the moment, well, let's take a step back. Like, why are we doing this? Coal and gas are the leading causes of the climate crisis. Any effective emissions policy should be cutting pollution from coal and gas. But this policy from Labor makes climate change worse by lifting pollution from coal and gas and allowing these massive new coal and gas projects to proceed. Labor's own figures back in at least 6 or 7 of the new massive gas projects going ahead, wiping out any potential gains from the safeguard mechanism. That's what we're trying to fix. And that's why we said, look, we'll set aside our concerns about it and pass it if they agree with this position that will stop making the problem worse.
My understanding is the government is not going to acquiesce to this. They are not going to give you this. So if they don't give you this, is that it? Is that the end of it? Or is this your starting position? What else could they do that would see you pass this legislation?
Look, it's an offer, not an ultimatum, Andrew, and we've made that clear. We've said, look, there's some significant problems with the scheme that have been pointed out by a number of groups and commentators. We'll put those aside and give it a go. Here's our offer, just stop making things worse by opening new coal and gas. Now, if Labor has a different way of dealing with the question of coal and gas, and some people, for example, have said, why don't we put a climate trigger in our environment laws so that you have to take into account what it's going to do for the climate when you're looking at new projects. That's a solution. That's a suggestion that's worth having a look at. Others have come out during the course of the week and said, well, why don't we put a pause on approvals while we have a look at how we deal with this in a holistic way. We're happy to have a look at suggestions that are put on the table about how to deal with this question of coal and gas, but the ball's squarely in the government's court now.
So Could the climate trigger get you over the line?
Look, we would certainly look at a climate trigger if the government was prepared to say you have to take into account what it's going to do for the climate when you're looking at these big new projects in Australia. We would certainly look at that. We've been calling for that for some time, and I welcome these suggestions that are being put forward by others as something to have a look at. But it has to deal with this question of coal and gas. We can't keep opening up coal and gas mines in the middle of a climate crisis.
Do you accept, Mr. Bandt, though, that we're in the position now?
More coal and gas.
Do you accept that it's a transitioning stage at the moment, that you can't have 100% renewable energy in this country? That's before I get to exports and so forth, which other countries can't have 100% renewables as well. Do you accept this is a transitioning phase?
Yeah, sorry, Andrew. Your question just cut out a bit there. But if the question is about the transition, what we're putting is a compromise offer. Okay, we don't agree with the government's targets are too low, and they'll see the Great Barrier Reef cooked. We think, as the Greens, that we need to go much faster, and that you'd need a plan to get out, ideally, in our view, out of thermal coal by 2030. We're not talking about existing projects, right? There's enough in the system at the moment for us to go through the transition. We're talking about new projects. That's why it's not. It's a very good faith compromise offer that we're putting on the table that sees us shift a huge way away from the position that we took to the election. It leaves enough in the system for that transition. It just says don't make the problem worse. And I think people understand that, and it's a sensible proposition. It's backed by the scientists, it's backed by the International Energy Agency, it's backed by the UN Secretary-General, it's backed by the Australian people.
Mr. Bandt, does the Kurri Kurri gas-fired power plant proposal feed into this? Are you asking for them to stop that particular proposal in your negotiations, or might you?
Well, we've got a separate position on that we've been putting, which is what public money should not be going to making the climate crisis worse. I mean, put aside Labor's desire to open up new coal mines, they certainly shouldn't be doing it using money that should be going to schools and hospitals. So on Kurri Kurri, and indeed on projects like the Middle Arm and any other infrastructure projects, not a single dollar of public money should be going to open up new coal and gas projects when we should be spending it on schools and hospitals and tackling the climate crisis.
All right, Mr. Bandt, could we see a situation where you allow the government to introduce the regulations forcing emitters to cut back, setting them a baseline, but don't pass the legislation because that allows offsets like planting trees and the like?
Well, look, the approach that we're taking is a good faith approach where, for us, we're happy to have discussions about both the legislation and the regulations, and we're putting it all on the table and saying, look, let's have a discussion about a pathway through, because we would like to see a policy passed that cuts coal and gas pollution in this country, and we're happy to look at whether that's in legislation or in regulations. But at the moment, what Labor's putting on the table is a policy that sees the situation get worse because they're opening new coal and gas mines, and at the moment, that's the sticking point.
All right, well, let's move to this National Reconstruction Fund bill now. Your amendment to this, proposed amendment, says an investment cannot occur from this fund for, and I quote, any activity the carrying out of which is inconsistent with Australia's greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets. Does that mean that a manufacturing project powered by gas wouldn't qualify under this change that you're proposing?
That's not the intention, and I don't think that's what the amendment does. What we're saying is that this reconstruction fund can't be turned in to a slush fund for new coal and gas infrastructure.
But Mr. Bandt, as my understanding, government, just on that, oh yeah, go on. But my understanding is there's no intention of the government to spend the money from that fund on those projects. Haven't they told you that?
Well, that's not in the legislation. That's not in the legislation at the moment, and during estimates last week, it was confirmed that that could be spent on that at the moment. And indeed, in previous governments, what we've seen is them try to, we saw the previous government try to pervert the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and use it to spend, and ARENA, the Renewable Energy Agency, and use it to spend money on projects that would have increased pollution. Now, we've been through that before. we're saying very clearly, don't give billions of dollars of public money over to, it might be that might be the minister's intention at the moment, but what about future ministers?
Okay.
If they have access to billions of dollars and they can spend it on coal and gas infrastructure, bearing in mind Labor is funding the Middle Arm project at the moment in the Northern Territory. That's why we're concerned.
Let me ask about the Housing Future Fund then. You say it just doesn't do enough in terms of constructing homes. What would satisfy you here to pass the legislation?
Well, again, this is legislation that sees the problem get worse. The housing waiting list is going to be longer at the end. It locks in an effective real cut in spending on public housing. And in years where the Future Fund doesn't return a profit, there might be zero spending at all. There's nothing for renters in this, and the government has said this is their signature policy for dealing with housing. So what do you want? Well, if your signature policy sees it get worse, it's in trouble. We want to see Commonwealth rent assistance doubled. We want to see $5 billion spent on housing. We don't want to see the funds cut in real terms. We want to see the housing crisis addressed, something to deal with the rental pressure that people are feeling now, something for First Nations housing, which currently isn't in the budget. Don't just make this all gambling on the whim of the stock market. I mean, imagine if we did that with public schools or public hospitals and said, sorry, there's no return yet from our investments on the stock market this year. There'd be an outcry. We need to think about housing in the same way.
Nearly out of time, just a couple of quick questions. You abstained on that bill in the House of Representatives. A few ministers and MPs went on the attack, painting you as in cahoots with Peter Dutton. Seems like a bit of a shot over the bows from the government, doesn't it?
Well, look, they can do that if they like. And again, I make the point on all of this, people get it, right? I know people are talking about 2009 again. Don't forget that after Labor refused to work with the Greens, you ended up in an election where Labor went backwards. I think people get, like, they want this parliament to solve the big issues, not pass policies that'll make them worse. That's what we're offering. We're putting it on the table. Just don't make the problems worse. Let's start fixing them instead. And I think people get what we're saying.
All right, just finally, I want to ask about this departure of Lydia Thorpe from the party, the first ever defection from the Greens. Shouldn't she just resign from the parliament? She was elected as a Green, and what's her departure meant for the party?
Well, look, obviously, as you know, Andrew, the way the system works is that parties might help someone get elected and then they get sworn in individually in their own right and they make decisions from there on in. Of course, I would have much preferred, and I spent a lot of effort to continue to try and ensure that we still had two Green senators representing us in Victoria. We don't. She's made that decision. We've just got to get on with it now. And I think, of course, for a lot of people inside our team, it's been very sad to watch this happen, and it's not what we wanted to unfold. But really, with all the challenges that we've got ahead of us at the moment, the cost of living crisis, the climate crisis, the housing crisis, the Greens are still in balance of power. The government still needs us to get legislation through when the opposition opposes it. So we're still there in Parliament. We've got to get on with the job.
Adam Bandt, thanks so much for your time this morning.
Thanks, Andrew.